Welcome to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs Denman Memorial Lecture. So today's subject is Britain really an Indo-Pacific power? And we're honoured to have as our speaker this afternoon, Lord Peter Ricketts. Peter Ricketts was the UK's permanent representative to NATO from 2003 to 2006, permanent secretary of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and head of the Diplomatic Service 2006 to 10, the UK's first national security advisor 2010 to 2012, and ambassador to France 2012 to 2016. Since 2016, he has sat as a crossbencher in the House of Lords, where he takes particular interest in home and international affairs, defence and justice. He's a strategic advisor to Lockheed Martin, visiting professor at King's College London, a non-executive director of ENGIE, chairman of the Franco-British Council and the Normandy Memorial Trust, a trustee of Leighton House Museum, and a member of the Royal Academy Development Fund. So with that, welcome, Lord Ricketts, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank, and delighted to be asked to give this lecture in memory of Lord Denman, who is a great name throughout much of my career, and to join the society, I think just after your meeting. So it's an honour for me. And I wanted to address a fairly wide-ranging topic to cover as much as possible of the field of Asian affairs. I have to say at the outset, I am not an Asia specialist, although I've passed a lot of my Foreign Office career admiring the experts that we have had and still have on Asia and its languages. I mean, to cut to the chase, the answer to my question, is Britain an Indo-Pacific power, is yes and no. Britain was a major Indo-Pacific power for centuries. We still have vital interests across the region. I think what I will argue is that this doesn't really add up to being a modern Indo-Pacific power in the sense that the government means it when it talks, for example, about an Indo-Pacific tilt in our policy. But we will come to that. Of course, the society doesn't need me to remind them of the deep and rich experience that Britain has in very many Asian countries. I would say that we have a greater level of understanding of many than, for example, the United States does. And that's true, for example, in the subcontinent and in Southeast Asia. Excuse me. Of course, our colonial past is now hotly debated. But I would say, having lived in France, that overall we made a better job of developing strong modern partnerships with former colonies than the French did with theirs, and that we've been more successful in incorporating Asian communities here into our national life in the UK. Our global, our Asian past is, of course, there in the structure of our modern economy. The stock of overseas investment in the UK, last time I looked, was £11 trillion, more than twice that of France. The most recent figures I found for the number of British people living abroad was 5 million, and many of those will be in Asian Commonwealth countries. So my Foreign Office career has kept bringing me up against the range of British interests in Asia. My first posting in Singapore in 1975 was just at the time the British were pulling out of the naval base in the north of the island, the last base, I think, east of Suez. Lee Kuan Yew was then laying the foundations of the extraordinarily successful economic miracle that Singapore performed in the following decades as one of the early beneficiaries of globalization. I also played a small part in the negotiations with China over the future of Hong Kong in 1982 to 84. That was one of the last great diplomatic set-piece negotiations about territory, and it was brilliantly led by the great sinologists of that generation, Teddy Yu, the governor of Hong Kong, Percy Craddock, the former ambassador in Beijing. And I think they did an extremely good job of nailing down the areas of economic autonomy that Hong Kong needed to go on prospering under Chinese rule after 1997. And in the 1990s, in the run-up to that, I was head of the Hong Kong department in the Foreign Office, and I was part of Chris Patten's battle to plant the seed of democracy in Hong Kong, even at that late stage. That failed, although he was absolutely right to make the attempt. But the painstaking detail in that joint declaration did give Hong Kong 20 years of relative stability and prosperity after 1997. I'm afraid the firewalls didn't hold when Xi Jinping decided to apply in Hong Kong his controls on every aspect of life and society that he'd already introduced in the mainland. These are in flagrant breach of the undertakings China gave us in 1984 in the joint declaration. It's been an awful time for the people of Hong Kong and for all Hong Kong's friends around the world. For my part, I fear that it will do lasting damage to Hong Kong's position as that international finance and business center, and the extraordinary buccaneering spirit that made such a feature of Hong Kong for many decades indeed. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I'm afraid that the damage from the last 2 or 3 years is now irreversible. On the situation in China, I'm much less equipped, of course, than others on this call to comment on it. But I will give you a couple of thoughts on the geopolitics of China's position now. I, for one, am not a critic of George Osborne's prediction of a golden decade in UK-China relations that he made in 2010. Those hopes have been dashed, but they were not unreasonable. If you think back to that 2010 period when he made that undertaking, the Chinese leaders of the previous 30 years had all been moderate, cautious, pragmatic men. Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. Their interest had been in China's economic development, and they were prepared to work with the West and cooperate in the structures of the post-war international settlement in order to achieve that. And in that period, we saw the reorganization of global manufacturing, the optimization of supply chains, which were the engines of global growth through that period. Those trends changed with Xi Jinping after he took supreme power in 2013. And together with his strengthening of grip on society and the economy, he also embarked on a much more assertive foreign policy. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, with infrastructure links to Asia and Europe, and his wish to dominate the sea areas around China, particularly the South China Sea. All that made the competition between the US and China for dominance in the Pacific and in future technological areas inevitable. And I think that struggle between the US and China is the generational national security issue ahead of us. You can already see it having the impact of fracturing what was a relatively joined up international set of rules and norms. That's clearly true in the trade area. It's also true, for example, in the internet, where the dream of a World Wide Web is rapidly cracking into an internet of Chinese dominance of control, of supervision of the citizen, an internet dominated by the American capitalist giants, and perhaps a smaller kind of internet area in Europe where privacy of data, protection of data takes higher priority. I think the tide of globalization, as we've known it in the last 20 years, is now receding. Countries, corporations are redesigning their supply chains to avoid dependence on China for the critical technologies and capabilities that they will need. And at the same time, the military confrontation with China is hotting up as it ramps up significantly its defense spending and deploys an advanced set of new weapons, some of them indeed intended to deter the US from exercising naval power anywhere near China and the waters that China regards as strategic. I will just pause there to take a sip of my tea, if I may. This is not another Cold War. That is a superficial analogy that misses the fact that these two economies, the US and China, are deeply, deeply intertwined with each other, even as they are increasing competition in other areas. At the same time as being security adversaries, they are commercial partners. And I think what we all have to hope is that that new form of cohabitation can be worked through in a way which avoids open conflict, even though there are significant flashpoints like Taiwan. One thing is for sure, this is going to be an uncomfortable world of great power rivalry for middle order countries. To coin a phrase and title of my book I published 6 months ago, they are going to have to make some hard choices. And all of this, I think, is of particular importance to the UK as it emerges from 5 years of divisive and difficult negotiations with the EU and the pandemic. We discovered how hard it is to negotiate a path that suits British interests between the US and the Chinese over the Huawei episode. If you remember, this was a case where Britain had decided, taking account of national security concerns, that it was safe to incorporate some Huawei equipment on the fringes of our new 5G network. The Americans not only disagreed, but they absolutely came down like a ton of bricks on the UK in order to get that decision reversed, to the point even of threatening the intelligence relationship. And Britain had no alternative but to back down and to accept total exclusion of Huawei and therefore significant extra cost and delay in its 5G rollout. All this, you will remember, in a context where actually the Americans did not have a technology of their own and were reduced to demanding that the UK should equip itself with other European technologies, Nokia and Ericsson. So that was both a real failure of strategic foresight in Washington and also a reminder of how little room for maneuver Britain had when the Americans decided that their own national security interests were at stake. We've just had in recent weeks an even more dramatic illustration of the same point over the chaotic endgame of the Western intervention in Afghanistan. I believe that President Biden's decision to press ahead with a very short frame pullout of American forces was largely down to his determination to clear the decks of existing American commitments for the looming confrontation with China. There was also no doubt a strong dose of US domestic politics there as well. But one of the sad ironies of this humiliating affair is that it both damaged America's reputation as an ally and also strengthened China's position in this strategic region around Afghanistan. China will now use its strong links with Pakistan to dominate events in that area, and other powers who are dependent on American security guarantees are left to ponder the consequences. What we've learned in the last few weeks is that despite President Biden's America is back rhetoric, which sounded very encouraging and optimistic in European ears, in fact, those allies like Britain who fought so loyally alongside the Americans for 20 years in Afghanistan had almost no influence on decision-making about the endgame. And since Britain had deployed the second largest number of troops in Afghanistan, taken the second largest number of combat deaths, this was particularly hard. We had discovered that our government has absolutely no leverage on a crucial US national security decision affecting our interests. So, how is all this relevant to my exam question about whether Britain can credibly present itself as an Indo-Pacific power? Certainly, we have strong trade and financial links across the region. Again, we have to keep that in proportion. Inevitably, given the huge distances from the UK, the trade in goods between the UK and our main Asian markets is dwarfed by the trade with our much closer European and North American partners. I think the figures are that the exports to the UK are still around 45% of the total, about 15% go to America, and therefore a much smaller proportion go to all Asian Indo-Pacific countries together. Of course, the damage which Brexit is doing to Britain's trade with our nearest neighbours makes it all the more important that we do develop new markets for our goods and our financial services. And Asian markets, rightly, are a priority. It's good to see free trade agreements with Japan and Australia, although when one looks at the numbers, they only add a tiny, tiny fraction of 1% of GDP against the hit of 5 or 6% of GDP, which Brexit seems to represent. And joining the aptly named Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of the most catchy titles I can remember for a long time, obviously that would be a very useful development as well. Although again, I think we have to not exaggerate the impact on Britain's trade and financial opportunities. So I totally accept that it is right that Britain should be actively engaged with our friends across the Asia-Pacific region. I think that leaving the EU may give us a bit more bandwidth to pursue that. I welcome the evidence that we are doing more in the defense area, for example, with Australia, where we have a lot of overlap of defense interests and a lot of shared equipment programs as well. I also welcome the growing security and defense link with Japan. I think that's very important. And a measured rebalancing of our diplomatic and our economic business support effort from government to tap into growth in Asia seems to me to make very good sense. As part of that, I believe that the UK has a clear interest in maintaining a working relationship with China. We recognize, I think, that wherever there is a security concern, that we will side with the US. But we need access to that Chinese market, which is the fastest growing major economy in the world. We also need a functioning political relationship with China, not least given that as chairman of the Glasgow Climate Change Conference in 2 months' time, we need to be negotiating with them as part of an overall deal. We need to be working with China to strengthen, for example, the WHO and try and build greater resilience in case we face another pandemic or other human health hazard, and in many other areas that people call the global goods. We need to be able to work with China. If that's what the government means by the Indo-Pacific tilt, then I'm all for it. My problem is that the political presentation of the idea in the run-up to the publication of that integrated review that the government put out in the spring suggested that it was more than a measured rebalancing. It seemed to me to carry echoes of an exceptionalist view of Britain's role in the world, which I think had also lurked behind the advocates of Brexit in the referendum campaign. A sense that freed from the shackles of the EU and benefiting from our strong relationship with Washington, Britain as an independent power would be free to range out and strike trade deals and cut a dash across the vastness of the Indo-Pacific region. I noted the rhetoric in the integrated review that talked about Britain shaping the international order of the future and of turning the dial on international issues of consequence. I have to say, I think all that looks a bit threadbare after the experience of Afghanistan in the last 2 months. And for me, the dispatch of the aircraft carrier to the Indo-Pacific, while a welcome gesture of defense diplomacy and providing some useful opportunities for joint exercises with our Asian allies, nonetheless risks sending the wrong message about Britain's pretensions to influence on the course of Asian security of a kind that we will not have. I think the issue of how we balance our relationship with the Indo-Pacific region and that of Europe, where so much of our economic interests and our security interests lies, is going to be a critical one for the kind of choices that Britain needs to be making. Excuse my voice. I think the balance is well caught in the decisions that will be needed on China policy, because I think the balance that the UK is looking for between competition and cooperation, between security, vigilance, and commercial opportunity is very much the same one as the EU looks to strike as well. And it's not quite the same one as the Americans are pursuing. The US as a superpower, seems to me, can afford a more across-the-board adversarial relationship with China as they struggle for who will be the dominant power in Asia and the dominant power over future technologies. I don't think Europe or the UK has the same interest. And I think that there is therefore a common interest for us to make with our European partners for a more differentiated or nuanced approach to China policy. And recognizing in my argument that we will not ourselves be a consequential Indo-Pacific security power, then we should be making common cause with others who share our interests. And I would use NATO actually as the forum to thrash out a Western strategy on China, which reconciles the interests which are not always aligned between the two sides of the Atlantic. I think Britain is very well placed to play that role of convening all the allies, perhaps including our Asian allies, Australia, South Korea, Japan, to try to forge such an agreement. I think being the largest European contributor to NATO gives us an opportunity to talk to Washington frankly. The fact that Washington ignored equally all the interests of the other allies in their decision-making on Afghanistan, I think gives us an opportunity to say to Washington that in order to restore confidence in America as a stable and reliable ally with strategic patience, both in the European security area and in the Indo-Pacific area, then deeper and serious real consultations over policy on China, setting a course which is sustainable for years and decades, would be a very good way of helping to repair that damage. And that needs America to listen as well as to announce their policy to us, and we need to find the right forum for that. I'm hopeful that the competition can be managed short of conflict. I'm hopeful that the interests of countries like the UK in a degree of stability in Asia will get through to Washington, and that we can help to shape the policy there. I'd like to see us playing a prominent role in that. And I think that that would be a greater contribution to Indo-Pacific security than the rather inflated rhetoric around Britain's Indo-Pacific tilt and the implication that we can be ourselves independently a serious actor in that region. So, Frank, I'm going to leave it there because I want to have the maximum time for people to question, challenge, make observations on that set of points. I mean, there are many more aspects of Asia that we could talk about, but rather than talk at greater length myself, I think I'd prefer to pick up anything people want to raise in questions.
Okay, super, Peter. Thank you. Michael, so do you want to open the floor to questions?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed,
please. Thank
Peter. And just a reminder to members of the audience, please use the Q&A button at the bottoms of your screens if you would like to put a question to Peter, and I will read them out so that the rest of the audience can hear what is being asked. While we're waiting for the audience to pluck up the courage to put
people are stunned by
yes,
the controversy that I launched.
We have William Crawley, can always be relied on. William asks, or rather states, I should say, several Asia-Pacific powers, including India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, seem not to be much concerned by China's restrictions on freedom of expression and other human rights issues. How much influence does Britain have in promoting these issues, or does it represent a handicap for Britain in achieving its commercial and other objectives?
Well, I mean, that's a very important question indeed, William, and I should have covered it actually. I mean, on India, no, they will not speak up about human rights and internal matters in China, just as they would object violently if others spoke up about human rights concerns in India. But they do have some very serious and deep security concerns about China. They've had clashes, of course, up on the glacier recently. And India seems to me to be coming more and more out of its shell in terms of willingness to participate actively in the emerging Quad discussions, and also involving Japan, Australia, and the US, in a way that they didn't do a few years ago, where they were very careful not to be seen to be, in any sense, lining up with Western countries against China. I think the India-China relationship has soured considerably because of China's security pressure on India, and that therefore that Quad has got new life and is an important forum now. So there are many countries who will not raise a voice about human rights abuses in China and Hong Kong. That's quite right. I mean, I don't think that that should deter the UK. And the UK, actually, I give credit to this government for the boldness in which they have condemned what's happened in Hong Kong. The offer of opportunity to come to the UK for existing British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong, the generous offer. I think the problem for the UK, and it's not just in relation to China, but particularly with China, is that now we're outside the EU. We have no cover at all for taking a prominent role on human rights. I think when we were part of the EU, countries had to calculate, do they want to take economic measures against a country criticizing us, if it means taking them against the whole of the EU? There was a degree of protection there. Now we don't have that. And we've seen in the case of Australia, that Australian criticism of the Chinese over the pandemic has led to some very harsh trade sanctions against Australia. So I'm afraid, my hard choices, my theme, applies in that area as well. The British government will have to calibrate constantly how firm and clear and hard they can be on human rights considerations in public as against commercial interests that might be put at risk. And that will be a messy case-by-case set of decisions, I think.
Thank you. And just sticking with India for a moment, Michael Burton asks, should we not be doing more to strengthen our relationship with India in order to balance China's projection of power?
Michael, thank you. And Michael, of course, is a real expert in this region. My own experience is that every British government comes into power and says we want to strengthen relations with India. That has been a theme for as long as I can remember. For example, in 2010, when I was David Cameron's National Security Advisor, David Cameron was determined we would strengthen relations with India. He mounted a big visit to India, taking a jumbo load of business people with him. We visited the Hindustani aircraft assembly line where BEA Hawks were being assembled, Bangalore, and so on. And in my experience, it never quite works. And I think, therefore, it's because India doesn't want to be drawn into too close a relationship with Western countries. I mean, they now have a pretty strong relationship with Washington, but they deliberately, I think, keep countries at arm's length who want to get too close. And even with the Commonwealth link and the cultural links that we have, the population links, I've found it never quite comes good in terms of the ambitions and the potential. And the potential is never quite realized. And I think if you talk to a lot of business leaders in the UK, they would say their experiences of business in India, investing and trading, have not always been entirely happy ones. So yes, I agree we should be strengthening relations with India, but I wouldn't hold my breath in terms of seeing that ambition translated into significant improvements in the overall relationship.
Thank you. Just I've got a cluster of questions coming about China, but just before I turn to those, Joseph Richardson asks, does Brexit not provide an opportunity for a deeper reappraisal of the UK's interests in a world which appears to have transcended the rules-based order established in the 1970s?
Well, I would say the rules-based order dates back to the 1940s and the creation of the UN, the GATT and NATO and those institutions which have still shaped diplomacy and international context ever since. Yes, we're certainly leaving the EU is a moment for reappraisal, definitely. But it needs to be a hard-headed, realistic appraisal based on our real measurable interests, not dreams of rule Britannia glory when the Royal Navy dominated the seas, or exaggerated expectations of what we can expect from a Washington which is increasingly preoccupied with its Asian interests, and the fact that these Asian markets are also extremely competitive. So I'm all for reappraisal. I think we should absolutely not lose sight of the continued economic and security importance of our backyard, which I don't think is going to change anytime soon. But striking, a new and perhaps rather different balance between the two, as I said in my talk, a measured and balanced shift of diplomatic, economic resources towards the Indo-Pacific. Why not? Absolutely. But let's not think that we can undo the damage done by leaving the EU and creating new barriers there by dramatic increases in our trade with Asia. I don't think that's going to happen.
I'm just going to put together 3 questions relating to China, if I may. First of all, and most broadly, Bill Hayton asks, do you think that we are in the middle of a great power transition with the US in decline and China in the ascendancy? More specifically, Philip Head asks, assuming a real possibility of a Chinese military takeover attempt of Taiwan within the short to medium term, what, if any, part can the UK play in defense of Taiwan, or should it? Do we just wring our hands over a far-off country? And then the third question is a much more narrowly focused one. You mentioned, Peter, that the deployment of HMS Queen Elizabeth to the Indo-Pacific is useful diplomacy. But Martin Perbrick points out that the carrier has US fighter jets on board, US fighter pilots and US escort vessels. How do we reconcile that with your comments about the UK taking a more nuanced approach towards China? Sorry, that's a very broad range of things to dump on you all.
No, that's good. And it shows the critical importance of policy towards China in any assessment of the UK's Indo-Pacific interests. So let's try and deal with them. They're all very good questions. In terms of macro long-term economic trends, is China in the ascendancy and the US in decline? I mean, I know economists argue forcefully about this, and they argue that raw comparisons of GDP size are a poor substitute for understanding a country's real power. And many American economists will make the case that actually the American economy is by many measures far stronger still than China's. Its pace of innovation, for example, is far greater. And American corporations are much freer of the constraints that Chinese counterparts have. I think the answer is we are in a long period of competition that will go on for decades. I mean, I don't think the Americans are in terminal decline. Look at the way the American economy has roared back into life after the pandemic, as of course has the Chinese. So no, I think we're in a period where there's going to be a rough balance that may tilt a bit over time, but the American military dominance will remain for the foreseeable future. Their technological innovation capacity is not going to go away, and they are going to be getting back into the manufacturing business, particularly of the security-related matters. So no, I mean, I think maybe if we look back in 50 years' time, if any of us are still here, we will see that China has clearly outpaced the Americans and is then the dominant world power. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I'm not sure China has the ambition to be the dominant global superpower in the way that the Americans had after the Second World War. I mean, perhaps that will change, but they want to be taken seriously and dominant in their own area and controlling a lot of the key technologies of the future, certainly. I don't see that they have an ideological offer to make to other countries of the kind that the Soviet Union tried to do, or indeed that the Americans tried to do during the Cold War, more successfully in their case. So no, I think we're in a period of a grey area struggle as one seeks competitive advantage over the other in different areas. Taiwan, I mean, I'm far from a specialist on Taiwan. I have been there in the last 2 or 3 years. I have great respect for them. My own assessment, which may be wrong, is that China is unlikely to send the Marines storming up the beaches of Taiwan to occupy it in an old-fashioned invasion. I mean, that would be extremely risky in terms of what reaction the Taiwanese could mount in the immediate hours and what the Americans might do. It seems to me it would also completely ruin China's international image, including in many countries, smaller countries, where they seek to have to be building their position, the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. If they destroy Taiwan in an old-fashioned invasion, I mean, that they can put an end to any pretensions to recruit a sphere of influence with countries that are willing to work with China. And it doesn't seem to me they will pay that price, or that they need to, actually. I mean, I think it's much more likely that they will go on trying to undermine, chip away at the democratic parties in Taiwan, make life difficult every time a democratic government is in power there, or a pro-independence government is in power there, and play a long game, which Chinese are good at, rather than risk everything on a military gamble. That's my assessment. As I say, I may be wrong. What role can the UK play? Well, let's be realistic. I mean, the UK is not going to play any significant military role in the case of a full-scale war over Taiwan. And apart from anything else, China's anti-ship weapons are extremely capable. And I think if the British carrier group was anywhere near Taiwan, it would have to, turn around and get a long way away to avoid a disaster. I think Britain should be a strong ally of America's, should do everything it can in the intelligence area, the diplomatic area, may be able to help the Americans by substituting in Europe as American forces are pulled out to deal with a hot confrontation in the Pacific. But no, not a serious British military contribution to anything like a hot war in the Pacific, which is why I say that I think the carrier deployment was more a gesture than a strategy. It was trying to send a message. It was useful in defense diplomacy, but it is not a real usable military asset against a first world, as it were, military power. And so to the third point, I mean, yes, absolutely. The carrier depends at the moment on US Marines for the aircraft. It depends on allies to supply some of the protective frigates and so on that need to deploy with it. It is a powerful military statement, of course, but it is a very limited military utility, I think, certainly in any independent sense for quite a long time to come, which is why I say it's a good piece of defense diplomacy. I mean, it's a very impressive piece of modern British engineering. It's a statement of intent to be more present in Asia. All that's good, but let's not regard it as a serious military capability of which the Chinese will adjust their policy to take account of. It's not that. Sorry, long answer, but 3 very good and interesting questions.
Thank you. And staying in much the same territory, well, I suppose we should, because it's all about Asia. But Peter Frankapan says, sort of very interesting, thank you. 2 short questions. How concerned should we be about the government's direction of travel? And also, how should the UK be engaging with Pakistan, both because of Afghanistan, but also India, Iran, and China?
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for your wonderful books, which I read avidly and admire. I'll start with Pakistan. Again, I found through the later part of my career, British governments have really tried hard to get alongside Pakistan. Excuse me. It was a major issue, of course, when the UK was still in combat in Afghanistan. I made many trips as National Security Advisor. David Cameron went there. Other ministers were there all the time. We really tried to build a security partnership with Pakistan, in part because the Taliban were presenting a real threat to Pakistan, and in part because of Pakistan's influence on Afghanistan and therefore on the safety and well-being of our forces there. Again, I mean, it never really worked. I mean, we have I think, a functional national security relationship with Pakistan, but I don't think it's a deep and trusting one. And that's partly because we're always looking over our shoulder at India, partly because, as you know better than I do, Pakistanis have put a lot of weight now on their relationship with China. And that seems to me, the strategic implication of what's happened in Afghanistan in recent weeks, that the Chinese position in the whole region, working with and through Pakistan, has strengthened. And the Chinese will now be looking to wrap Afghanistan into the Belt and Road, to use Afghanistan for some of the transport networks they're building and so on. They'll be after the minerals in Afghanistan, of course. That brings them into interesting relationship with the neighbors of Afghanistan. I mean, on the other side, Iran in particular. Iran taking quite an interesting, strongly anti-Taliban position at the moment, and the Central Asian states as well. So, I mean, I think there's enormously strong UK-Pakistan links in the non-governmental areas, the communities, in many business areas. But on the security side, it will always be a cautious relationship, I think, on both sides. And in a way, a counterbalance of the relationship with India. They never quite, either of them, come through to a full, confident relationship of the kind that one would like to see. And I've now forgotten the first part of Peter's question, Michael.
Well, it's very good that you have, Peter, because in the meantime, Peter Frankapan has clarified that he didn't quite mean what he asked. He says, how concerned should we be about the direction of travel of the government in India?
Of the Indian government rather than our own government, I take it.
That is my understanding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we should. Prime Minister Modi's government is not a comfortable ally. I tried to explain that I think we have, some quite aligned interests in the handling of China, as India is prepared to take a more confident, perhaps, and a more open position in opposing China's security ambitions in the region. But Prime Minister Modi's internal affairs, human rights respect, other areas as well, are making life difficult for British companies and make it uncomfortable for the British government as well. And of course, the Indians are intensely prickly to any criticism of their own internal affairs and their human rights record and so on. And yet we have very powerful and strong interests. And we've had a question already about why doesn't Britain strengthen its interest in India, a major Asian Commonwealth country. So, dilemma. We clearly must continue a dialogue with India, but at least privately, I hope that some messages are being passed that if India wants to be seen as a country in the Quad, for example, working with America, Japan, and Australia, then its internal affairs, its treatment of minorities, its attitude to the press, and so on, are all going to be scrutinized. And they're going to have to get used to that.
Thank you. Richard Oppenheimer asks, to what extent can or should the UK seek to influence recent events in Southeast Asia, and in particular Burma?
Well, it's the old story, isn't it? How much influence can Britain exercise in how many different places at the same time? Excuse me. And Southeast Asia is quintessentially a place where Britain has had the deepest, longest, richest experience from colonial times. And therefore, Britain knows more about these countries and has a series of very, very deep relationships, some of them through the Commonwealth. Does that mean that Britain should be playing a leading part in dealing with the real continuing problems in Burma? I mean, question mark. I think there is a limit to how much influence Britain can exert in how many different places. As I go back to what I was saying earlier, we have to be realistic about the bandwidth that we have. It wasn't long ago when the British government was pretty much off the air for foreign policy altogether, completely absorbed in Brexit and the polarized negotiations with the EU. And for several years, we really weren't there on the international stage at all. And we have many, many other priority issues that we need to be tackling and dealing with. So I would like to say that Britain ought to be a leading country in trying to move things forward from the pretty bad state they are in Burma. But I just feel that in the end, Britain is going to have to make some choices about where it deploys its diplomatic effort, its political muscle. And Burma may not be on that list for priority attention. I think that's one of the issues that Britain as an independent operator outside the EU has to face.
Just going back to China, this is a very much a China internal question, but Richard Ellis asks, is there any opposition within China to the current belligerence of the current regime?
Well, there will be greater China experts on this call than me. And inside China, are there opponents? Who knows? I mean, there clearly are going to be a lot of people who disagree with the trend of Xi Jinping's policy, but the reach and effectiveness of the security controls operating on Chinese people now is very, very extensive. The use of AI, the use of the latest technologies to monitor behavior, monitor internet behavior, keep the closest eye on the citizen. I mean, they are very, very powerful controls of internal security. And therefore, I think to be an opponent in any visible way is very dangerous. Just let me say, though, and if there are China experts on the call who want to comment, please do. It seems to me that alongside the great power that Xi Jinping has amassed, there is an intrinsic fragility and vulnerability there, partly because he has all the power in his own hands. Whatever goes wrong comes down to him in the end now, partly because he's interrupted what was the rather well-organized progression towards the next generation of leadership, with each supreme leader taking 10 years and then stepping aside for the next one. And you could already begin to see the next one becoming the prime minister, building up towards the supreme role. Xi Jinping has abolished term limits and has abolished that kind of talent management, if you can call it that, among the next generation of leadership, as far as I can see, and therefore is ruling alone, but is very isolated. And there are the seeds there, it seems to me, of future instability in China when his powers begin to wane. And you have to think back to Deng Xiaoping, I suppose, to remember a period of lengthy period of decline of a senior leader, of course Mao as well. So that seems to me that within the apparently all-powerful aura of Xi Jinping, there are elements of fragility.
Well,
but I may be wrong.
I just repeat Peter's invitation to any China specialists in the audience, and I know there are some who wish to comment on that question. Peter Frankapan has said the following: for what it's worth, my own view is that rather than asking if and how she is gathering power or becoming more militaristic, we should be thinking about why he is doing so. I think that's a productive line of investigation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or has done so, I think one could almost say, because it seems to me he's amassed pretty well every line of power in his own hand. But some of his policies, like Belt and Road, are not in great shape. And so, as I say, having amassed total power, in the end, he bears total responsibility. And that is an area of vulnerability, it seems to me.
Mm. There are other questions, and I will come to them, but I'd like just to interject one of my own, if I may. You said quite early in your presentation, Peter, that the US-China rivalry was not a new Cold War, and you described that the key differences between the present situation and that as it stood between the Soviet Union and the West. And primarily, of course, the fact that China is a massive economic power in a way that the Soviet Union never was, and that there is huge economic integration between China and the rest of the world. All of that is obviously true. It was famously also true of Europe before the First World War, but that did not stop a calamity. Is that too shallow a parallel, do you think? I mean, the circumstances more than 100 years apart clearly are different, but do we put too much hope in the fact of those economic interdependencies?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating question, Michael, and I'm not a historian by trade, but I would emphasize, as you've done there, that the Cold War was essentially an ideological struggle. You know, there were two clear ideologies, and they were in competition. China is not offering an ideology. I mean, America is, in a sense, open, liberal, democratic power. They are presenting an economic and a technological challenge, but not, I think, an ideological one. So I do think it's different, as you say, with the intertwinedness as well. I mean, the critical difference to me from the First World War is that that build-up to the First World War was an interlocking series of alliances, wasn't it? Countries had a complex network of different alliances with different commitments, which were more or less automatic commitments to each other to mobilize if the other was attacked and so on. And that doesn't exist in Asia. Arguably, it exists in Europe with NATO, although NATO is, it's a very nuanced treaty when you read it. In Asia, that doesn't exist. So I don't see us being carried to war by, a series of commitments that the two protagonists have entered into, which can drag all the rest into a war. I don't think it's that. And I also come back again to the issue of nuclear weapons. I mean, I think the presence of nuclear weapons in the equation just changes the balance completely, really, the risk calculus. And hence, we've got so much proliferation of hybrid warfare, confrontation below the level of armed forces clashing in open battle, from subversion through cyber attacks, and stealing of intellectual property, and all the rest of it. And it seems to me that that domain is more likely to be the domain where we have serious problems between the US and China, but not a shooting war with the potential risk of an escalation to nuclear use.
Thank you very much. I'll just relay a question from Frank, unless, Frank, you'd like to pose it yourself, shall I? I'll read it out.
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Frank says, there are deeply entrenched and arguably often extreme views on China on both sides of the Atlantic. And you mentioned the need for deeper and serious consultation between the US and the UK on China, and the need to find the right forum. Do you have any thoughts on what this might be?
Well, I do have thoughts. I'm not sure that they're widely accepted. If we are talking about security issues, the best place for the Europeans and the Americans to talk is in NATO, because NATO is a political organization as well as a military one. So NATO can perfectly well consult on China without any implication that we're going to extend Article 5 and collective defense to Asia. NATO has consultations on all sorts of subjects. And my preference would be to invite the Australians and the Japanese, perhaps the South Koreans, all of whom worked with NATO in Afghanistan. The Australians and South Koreans had forces in Afghanistan alongside NATO, and use NATO as a forum for security discussions about China. After all, there are times when there are more Chinese warships in the Mediterranean than there are French warships. So China is a factor in NATO security already. I think more widely, I don't think NATO is going to be the place for the kind of coordination of technological policies that we need as well. When I mentioned Huawei, where we were in the ridiculous position of the Americans vetoing any use of Huawei in our 5G without having an American solution of their own to offer in its place. And that suggests a failure of foresight and the need for Western coordination on technologies of the future, AI, robotics, chip technology, and so on, so that there are Western alternatives to Chinese manufactured technology for the future. And I'm not sure NATO is the right place for that. I mean, we had COCOM during the Cold War. Indeed, I think COCOM still exists, but maybe there's a G7 linked group or something that could be set up there. I don't think it's clear yet where the forum will settle for talking about the wider security and technology concerns about China. But I think NATO is certainly there to be used on kind of hard security, if I can call it that.
Thank you. And I think we're almost at close here. So it may be the right moment to ask a slightly more light-hearted question, but certainly one that is about Britain's soft power at any rate. What about the place of sport in UK relationships with the Indo-Pacific region? Asks Adrian Steger.
Well, and absolutely right to ask it too. I mean, there's a whole dimension of soft power that we haven't talked about. Sport, obviously, football, the wonderful Olympics we held here in 2012. Culture, theatre, music, educational links, the British Council, the English language, the BBC, the British Council. I mean, these are all powerful British soft power assets, and many of them avidly consumed across Asia. The problem for the government is that they're not controlled by the government, and they can't really be influenced by the government, and they don't yield intergovernmental benefits particularly. I mean, I think they put up British attractiveness as a destination, as a source of learning English or enjoying culture and sport and football. But I don't think they weigh in the kind of governmental balance of how to exercise British foreign policy influence in the region, put it like that. So yeah, we must not miss out that whole area of life and the people-to-people exchanges as well. I mean, there are the vast communities that we have from many countries here in the UK and British communities in Asia are also sources of soft power importance. And last of all, I would say, okay, don't let's forget cricket. If you're going to mention football, cricket is a pretty powerful area, at least of friendly rivalry between Britain and many Asian countries, who usually beat us.
Indeed. Well, we are exactly on the hour there. So I think it remains for me, Peter, to thank you very much indeed for giving us your views on this today. It's been an extremely interesting discussion. There are other questions that could be asked, but I think we will have to, with apologies to those whose questions we haven't reached, we will have to close it there. Could I just remind the audience that in 2 weeks' time, on the 22nd of September, we are hosting Prince Turki Al Faisal, former head of the Saudi General Intelligence Directorate, who will be talking about the Afghanistan file, essentially about his own time trying to persuade the Mujahideen factions post-Soviet withdrawal to stop fighting each other, and why it didn't work. And I hope we'll see many of you then. But for now, once again, Peter, thank you very much. And to all of our audience, thank you very much indeed. Goodbye for now, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.